Hello! November wrap-up time already, and I can't quite believe that we're here, but I did manage to complete quite a few books this month, so let's get into it. First of all, I'm going to start with the two books that I don't own, just so I don't forget to talk about them. So first of all, we have This Savage Song by Victoria Schwab, which is a reread for me, so naturally I did that on audio, and I actually borrowed this one from my library. And this series follows two characters, August Flynn and Catherine Harker, or Kate, and they live in a city called Verity. In Verity, there are monsters that are created out of the evil deeds committed by humans. So if you kill someone, you spawn a Maokai, which is essentially a vampire. If you commit some other kind of violent act, then you create a Corsi, which is sort of like a zombie but shadowish. It's a bit difficult to explain. And then there are Sunai, of which we know very little. And Kate is the daughter of the leader of one half of the city, and August is the son of the leader of the other half of the city. And as you can imagine, the two sides of the city don't necessarily get on with each other too well. And I absolutely loved this book the first time I read it last year, and I really enjoyed it on reread too. The audiobook was very good, in case you're wondering about that. But I just found the story still very fast-paced, very interesting premise, and I really connected well with the characters, so it was definitely a win of a reread for me. Then we have Five Dark Fates by Kendara Blake, which is the final book in the Three Dark Crowns series, and this is a series that I've had a little bit of trouble with. I of course can't tell you what Five Dark Fates is about, but I can tell you what Three Dark Crowns is about. It follows three sisters who are equal heirs to the throne, and they live on an island called Fenburn, and the way Fenburn chooses its queens is by one of the two sisters managing to survive the others, the point being that they kill each other in order to ascend the throne, which promises to be incredibly brutal. When I first heard that premise, I got sort of Hunger Games type vibes, but don't be fooled, it's nowhere near as brutal as it sounds, which is why as a series it didn't work so well for me. There was a lot of plot that I felt like wasn't necessary, and I see now, having read the final book, why all those things were necessary, but I still think we potentially could have had a trilogy instead of a quartet. I think it's a quartet, and possibly even a duology would have been even better if the books had just been slightly longer and then everything had been condensed down into a duology. It might have been a bit better. I think the final book in the series did bring some of that brutality that I was expecting, but for me it was already a little bit too little too late for the series. I've heard people say that the ending was shocking. I didn't find it shocking, I found it predictable. I found that it ended the way I predicted it would end at the beginning of book one. So that's just me. It's a series that I wanted to finish because I'd read the first three books, and I read the first three books because I bought them before reading the first one, which is a lesson I have learned now. But yeah, not a massive win for me, unfortunately. I might as well talk now about my other reread, since I've already mentioned one of them, and that was Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, which I read in preparation for Starsight, which just came out on the 26th of November, and I'm actually currently in the process of reading that one as I'm filming this. This follows a character named Spencer, who lives on a planet called Detritus, who is at war with an alien species known as the Krell. Now, the people on Detritus pride themselves on being brave. It's their #1 accolade within the community, and anyone who's seen as less than that is very much looked down upon. Spencer has a dream to become a pilot in the Air Force in the war against the Krell, and that is is the high of society, the most respected people in the society, because they're considered the most brave. And Spencer is very, very keen on joining the Air Force, but although you might think that she's a perfect candidate, especially with the sense of bravery that we get from her at the beginning of the novel, she's actually branded a coward simply because her father was branded a coward when he very famously turned tail and ran during the midst of a very important battle. And for some reason the people in this world think that cowardice is hereditary and therefore Spencer is not suitable to be a pilot. But she's determined to go to pilot school and we follow her journey. I really enjoyed the reread of this. I thought that the audiobook was absolutely fantastic actually. The narrator is Sophie Aldred and she was just absolutely fantastic. The voices that she used for the various characters was amazing and I really, really enjoyed rereading this on audio. I had planned to read Starsight as a physical read, but I was really just missing the voices that she gave to the characters, and she really adds something to the story and brings it even more alive. So I caved and I've downloaded the audiobook to read and listen at the same time. But as for my reread of Skyward, I really, really enjoyed myself. Next up, I'm going to talk about The Toll by Neil Shusterman, which was one of my most anticipated reads for the year because it is the conclusion to the arc of the Scythe trilogy. I read Scythe and Thunderhead last year and absolutely loved them. I reread them last month and still absolutely loved them, and so I was so excited to pick this one up, and it's a real chunker which made me even more excited. And this went in a lot of directions that I wasn't anticipating, which is a good thing. I couldn't predict what was going to happen at the end of the story. There were certain things during the course of the story that I felt like I knew how they were going to turn out, and I was right, but I don't think that's because it was predictable. I think that it's because the author left you the clues there to figure it out for yourself, and I really enjoyed this conclusion. I feel like I do need to read it again because there was just so much going on. There's lots of different plot lines happening and it was a lot to keep up with, so I do definitely want to reread it probably pretty soon, but I did really enjoy the conclusion to this series. I can't tell you what this book is about, of course, but in case you haven't heard of the Arc of the Scythe series, it is set in a futuristic version of the human race where all forms of death have been eradicated, and now the only danger to society is overpopulation. So the Scythedom was born, a group of humans whose sole job it is to glean people, gleaning being the only way that people can now die. And we follow two apprentice scythes as they learn all there is to learn about the Scythedom and gleaning, and discover that perhaps things aren't quite going the way that they should. Then I had my book club book, which is We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faisal, and unfortunately this one didn't really work for me, which is really, really sad, and I know that those of us who read it together as part of the book club had pretty similar feelings. This follows two characters. Sophia is a hunter who pretends to be a man because her role as a woman in society is not to be the provider, but she has magical powers that allow her to enter into a wood that turns everybody else mad and they're not able to come back, whereas she can. We also follow a prince named Nasir who is essentially the king's assassin and everybody's afraid of him, and both of them end up searching for an artifact that will help the land that they live in general, and so their paths naturally cross, and there's a little bit of romance going on as well. I just feel like this book was a perfect setup for an epic fantasy series, but the author just didn't go into enough depth in terms of the world building and the building of the magic system and the character development and the relationship development to pull it off as an epic fantasy story. And it was too loose to be a high fantasy as well, because it was trying to introduce all of these rules, but then they didn't really come to fruition at all, and so it just made it a little bit difficult to follow. I didn't buy any of the relationships between the characters. We were told that they were important relationships and we were told how the characters were feeling, but we weren't ever shown any of those things at any point, which is really disappointing because I feel like it could have been great and it had all the hallmarks of being great, but unfortunately the execution just did not work for me at all. I really praise this author because she tried to do something really important and provide Muslim girls with a character that they could relate to, and of course I can't speak to the relatability, but she was very much, Sophia was very much trying to push beyond the societal boundaries that are put in her place, and I really commend the author for doing that. Unfortunately, as a seasoned fantasy reader though, this really didn't work for me, and I almost wish that the author had tried to write this as low fantasy or even as contemporary instead. Then another book that I read as part of a read-along, More Than We Can Tell by Brigid Kemmerer, and this one I like to describe as a young adult and healthy version of 50 Shades of Grey. Bear with me. It's not, at all what 50 Shades of Grey is, but in terms of the relationship, I definitely see some similarities. So we follow Rev and Emma. Emma uses programming and video gaming as a means of escaping her life, and Rev has a dark past involving some abuse when he was a child that he really struggles with, and he struggles with this concept of being an awful person and potentially being harmful to those around him, and he and Emma meet and form this relationship. And I don't want to say too much about why it reminds me of 50 Shades of Grey, because it particularly reminds me of the final book in that series, 50 Shades Freed, and I don't want to spoil that one in case there's any chance that you haven't read it yet, but you'll just have to trust me on this. The parallels are there. If you've read 50 Shades Freed, if you've read 50 Shades Freed and you decide to pick this one up, then keep an eye out for it because it's definitely there. The parallels are there, I promise, but like I said, it's just a much more healthy version. Rev has this dark past and has to struggle with it, and struggles with how that darkness might impact on his future relationships, but he doesn't use that as an excuse to become an incredibly messed up person. And Emma has her own stuff to deal with, and she's very strong, but she doesn't necessarily rely on people when she should, and so when Rev does try to help her, she tries to push back against it, and they're really there for each other in ways that you wouldn't expect. And I read this in one sitting. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it would absolutely be one that I would reread, which, as I always say, is a really good mark of enjoyment for a book, because I don't tend to reread them unless I really enjoyed them the first time round. Speaking of books that I would reread, next we have Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I originally listened to on audiobook, having borrowed it from the library, and I enjoyed it so much that I went out and bought a copy of it so that I could reread it at some point. This, in case you haven't heard of it somehow, follows a fictional 70s rock band and the story of how they got together, their time together, and why they broke up. And it really reads like non-fiction. It really does. It's quite incredible actually. It's told in interview format, and you don't know who the interviewer is throughout the story, but that interviewer is interviewing different members of the band to find out their perspectives on what happened. And not all of those perspectives are the same. All of these characters are very grey. There's lots going on that is really bad. Trigger warnings for lots of things in here. There's a lot of drugs. It's fairly messed up, but it's thoroughly entertaining, and I really felt like this band was real. It's very odd. You'd have to read it to understand what I mean, but it truly does read like non-fiction, and I honestly had no problem believing throughout this entire read that this band was real, which it's not, and Daisy Jones isn't real, but I don't know, it was just so believable. I thoroughly enjoyed this one, and again, it is one that I will be rereading at some point. I'm now just very quickly going to mention The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh quickly, because I've done a full review of this one on my channel, which I will link up above for you. This is a vampire film noir style book which is set in 1872 New Orleans. There's a mystery going on, there's vampires going on, and it's very dark and atmospheric, and I really enjoyed this one too. But like I said, full thoughts in my review. Then we have The Merciful Crow by Margaret Owen, which is a very interesting one. So this follows a character named Fi, who is part of the Crow caste, and in this land people are separated in sort of like a class system, but with castes that are based on birds. So for example, we have the Crow caste that Fi is a part of, who don't have any magical abilities other than being able to call on bone magic, specifically using teeth to utilise the powers of the witches from other castes. We also have Phoenix caste, who have the birthright of fire, Splendid caste including Peacock, Swan and Dove, who are glamour, desire and artistry respectively, etc. The Phoenix caste is the very top of society, that's the royalty, and the Crow caste, as you can imagine, is the very bottom of society, and their role is to collect the bodies of people who have died of a plague that runs rampant in this land. And eventually, Fi and her band of crows enter into a bargain to help these young men get to their ultimate destination in exchange for protection. This magic system is incredibly interesting, and I feel like we've barely touched the surface of it in this book. I'm pretty sure this is going to be a trilogy. It's definitely the first book in a series, and I hope that in future books we get more detail on the magic system, because we've really, like I said, only just scratched the surface of it. It's a very complex magic system and world. I really enjoyed the relationships that were built in this book, and I'm hoping that we'll build on those more in later installments in the series. And the plot was very interesting, if a little bit difficult to follow, simply because of the complexities of the world and magic system. So I do recommend this one. I think my enjoyment of it was hampered slightly by the fact that I read it over the course of nearly 2 weeks because I was just so busy at work. I think that I probably would have followed the story a little bit better if I had read it more quickly, but that's not the book's fault, that's my fault. So yeah, enjoyed this one, and potentially I would reread it before reading the next one in the series, because I think that this is the kind of book that you really need to understand what's going on to understand what's going on, you know? And then the final book I'm going to talk about is The Wicked King by Holly Black, which is book 2 in the Folk of the Air trilogy. And again, this is a sequel, so I can't tell you what this one's about, but the first book follows a character named Jude, who is human, but her sister is half fae. And when her sister's fae father comes to return her to fairyland, Jude's biological parents are murdered by him, and she is then raised by her parents' murderer as his own. And then Jude becomes involved in a spy network in the Fae world, which is full of deceit and lies, which is very interesting considering that Fae actually can't lie, and everybody is really very cruel to each other generally, but especially to Jude because she is human. This book is the continuation, and I really enjoyed myself apart from the very ending, which drove me nuts in a good way, but oh my goodness, the ending of this book, I wanted to throw the book across the room. I was so mad. I'm really glad that I'm going to be getting Queen of Nothing soon. I will be reading that, and if it doesn't go the way I want it to, then I will be very, very cross. But yes, I enjoyed this one. The cruelty from the first book definitely continues in this one, and the angst and build-up of relationships is still very, very engaging. I don't want to say too much because of spoilers potentially for the first book, but if you know, you know. There are a couple of relationships in this that I particularly find frustrating, and that's all I'm going to say about this one for now. And that's it. Those are the 10 books that I read in the month of November. As you can see, I, for the most part, really enjoyed the books that I read this month. Did you read anything that you really enjoyed in November? Let me know down in the comments, and that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks, bye!